Last time I was on the show, I discussed the emergence of the post-woke left, and I'd like to continue in that vein because I think there's a lot more to say. I specifically would like to talk about how the post-woke left, some of the figures that I discussed last time, are approaching the topic of immigration, right, which is the most pressing issue of our time in Britain. It's by far the most important issue to the majority of the public, as dozens, I don't know about dozens, but many polls show it's hugely important. It has been for a long time because the British public has been so poorly served by their leaders.
Even on lefty polls like YouGov, which are sort of self-selecting, left-biased polls.
Yes, indeed.
Still the most important issue.
Yes, so before we begin in that sort of vein, I'd like to promote this event, which I am running alongside Eric Kaufman, titled Is Woke Dead? With Matt Goodwin, Gad Sad, and Batya Ungar-Sargon. If you want to go and you are a Lotus Eaters viewer, you can use the code LOTUS25 for 25% off tickets. So there should be a link down below to that if you're interested in coming. So, let's begin. I want to present 5 Marxist arguments against mass immigration, okay? Because I think that it's important that we learn from our enemies. It's important that we take what we can from their ideas. And I think using their language against them, I've done this myself, it caused them to just sort of short circuit. They don't know how to come back against it. When you reveal them to be actually agents of the establishment and not the radicals that they like to imagine themselves as. So I want to begin with a letter that Karl Marx himself wrote to 2 of his collaborators in the United States, Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt, in 1870, in which he speaks of the impact of Irish immigration to England. So he says that owing to the constantly increasing concentration of leaseholds, Ireland constantly sends her own surplus to the English labour market, and thus forces down wages and lowers the material and moral position of the English working class. And most importantly of all, every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into 2 hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life, and in relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. So there's quite a bit to unpack
there. Making some good points, though.
Yeah, but there's some real truth in there. I mean, obviously, it's all couched in the language of, the English working class have a false conscience and they need to kind of break out of it. Yeah, but actually, a lot of what he says there is totally spot on and very applicable today. So the first argument we're going to look at is the fact that mass immigration is a weapon of capital against labour. So in 2017, here as reported by Politico, the business group London First was lobbying the government in the aftermath of Brexit for an increasingly liberal immigration policies after leaving the European Union.
Makes sense why they're called London First.
Well, I was going to say that. I think it's quite, the fact they're called London First is just quite revealing, isn't it?
Now, why Boris is right.
Yeah, so London First is now called Business London, and we can see some of their members here. So we've got, various sort of property groups, real estate groups, financial services organisations, and then huge companies like Deloitte and Uber.
Of course, Uber's on there, right?
Yeah, London Gatwick Airport and all the rest of it. These are not like communist organisations. This is capital, right? This is the capitalist
international
class.
Capital.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And these were the people in 2017 lobbying for an increased, sort of a more liberal immigration system. We also have the boss.
Just as a stop on that, because I've had these arguments with leftists on Twitter so many times. Like, it's not the immigrants, it's the business owners, and it's like there is really no distinction between those two, because who do you think the business owners are using against the natives, you fool?
Yes, exactly. And this is the point, and this is really what I'm going to be driving at here, is that the idea that mass immigration is some kind of Marxist plot is I think it's just nonsensical. It's, the language of progressivism and kind of liberalism is used to sell it to the masses as it being a kind of compassionate thing that people should embrace. But actually, the people who are really benefiting at the end of the day are people like this chap, the boss of Next, who in 2022 was urging the government to let more foreign workers in to ease labour shortages. Now, at the time, I mean, he was another Brexiteer. He's a conservative. He's a conservative peer, and yet he's one of the foremost architects of the current immigration system that we have. Because at the time when he was saying this, net migration was sitting at about 239,000 a year. It's like, Imagine it. And that's still mad.
And of course, he was a Tory peer.
I hate the phrase labour shortages as well, because there's no shortage of labour. We've never had more population in this country ever before.
Cheap labour shortages, perhaps, as well.
That's exactly. Who was it the other day who was complaining that 25? Oh, it was Fraser Nelson. It was like 25% of Birmingham is on benefits. So there's no labour shortage. It's just we are incentivising people not to work.
Yes, exactly. So obviously, it was revealed yesterday that gross migration is now 1 million, with net being 500,000. So I hope Lord Wolfson is happy with
and
where we're at
just
now.
to be clear, like I covered this yesterday, like the if you look at the graph, gross migration of 1 million is unprecedented prior to the Boris wave. Right? If you take the Boris wave out of this, a net migration of nearly 500,000 is record-breaking migration into this country. And so it's just the Boris wave makes that look less damaging, but it's still insane.
Well, I think that they are relying on the public having a short memory on this topic, but I don't think they do. Because you could see it around you.
Yeah, you look at the high streets.
So just to drive home this point then, that mass immigration is a weapon of capital against labour, it's very easily shown that mass immigration suppresses wages by supply and demand. You inflate the workforce, and especially when you introduce people from regions of the world that are impoverished, like, for example, India and Nigeria, who are the two most common non-EU nationalities to come in the last 5 years. India, for example, the average yearly salary is £3,500, okay? And so why wouldn't those people come here when the economic prospects are so much better?
There's also... They're not only willing to work for less money, they're willing to work in worse conditions for longer hours as well. What you're actually opening up is your domestic labour force to competition with international slave labour.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can't compete with international slave labour.
Just a quick thing on this as well. It's not like leftists haven't historically made this argument either.
Of course,
Jeremy Corbyn was making this argument 30 years ago until he became... There's something about being a woke liberal globalist that they use the language of Marxism to go full universal globalism, and the Marxists are completely hamstrung by it, because you've got people like Peter Kropotkin in The Conquest of Bread, who points out, look, the wealth of the capitalist comes from the poverty of the labourer, because if he wasn't impoverished, he wouldn't work in these slave conditions for the international capitalist. And so you must, any kind of immigration argument, it's if you're looking at your own population saying, right, they're actually not poor enough to work in this kind of deep, embarrassingly subsistence position. We will just import people who know nothing else as competition for them. You can't possibly say that that's in any way good for the country or good for the people. There's just no argument for it.
And George Galloway, for example, still says this kind of thing, despite the alliances that he makes. He does still believe this, which is and it's because he is actually a more orthodox kind of leftist.
He's a sort of classic leftist.
And so this is shown by the fact, obviously there are other factors at play, but since 2008, the average wages have just not kept pace with inflation, not kept pace with GDP growth as well. GDP has gone up, but GDP per capita has essentially flatlined since then. And all of this is because all of this leads to the fact that most migrants who come here are actually imposing a net cost on ordinary people, on taxpayers. But hey, thank goodness, next to getting cheap labour, right?
Yeah, and the Deliveroo economy is just like what are they paying into the thing? Nothing.
There is also an interesting argument to be made regarding the birth rates as well, because birth rates are one of the ways in which they like to continually justify, well, if we don't have the birth rates, then we're going to find another way of replacing the population that's already here, so we need to bring people in. There has been more recent research done suggesting that a greater diversity of ethnic groups within the population suppresses the birth rates. So they're creating the problem or making the problem worse with the solution. Again, it's poison for the cure.
And this brings us to the next point, which is that mass immigration makes class consciousness impossible, because this idea that some, like a 23-year-old Eritrean Deliveroo driver is going to have some kind of brotherhood or kinship with a 56-year-old builder is just absurd. It's a crazy idea.
I've covered this. The Amazon have studied it within their own warehouses. They have a unionization metric by which they score different factors that lead to their staff unionizing in the warehouse and factories. And diversity reduces the chances of unionization drastically.
Oh, really? Well,
so
as a hyper-capitalist, I need to get some different hosts.
Yes, very good.
But just a quick thing on this as well. This is something that has, again, been known by the communists for a long time. Because you remember that the end of the Communist Manifesto is the working men have no country. They've already been stolen from by the capitalists. So working men of all countries unite. Well, come World War I, The fear of Bolshevism. No, it turns out that people are actually a lot more attached to their own countries than there are their own class anyway.
Totally, yeah.
And then if you disintegrate the class itself, well, then what have they got?
And this is the point. In order to have class consciousness, you know, the precondition to that is a shared trust, a shared identity. This idea of the kind of international working class is just nonsensical.
On that point, recently I read a very interesting book called Russia under the Bolshevik Revolution, by Richard Pipes, and he's talking in the chapter about the attempts to export communism in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Civil War, and he talks about how they were setting off to war against Poland because there was that short war there where they were trying to take over, and the Russians, Lenin was just expecting that the Polish proletariat would be so eager to join up with the Red Army and usurp their own government. It turns out, in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles finally getting some kind of sovereign independence as their own nation, the Polish proletariat was a lot more attracted to their own nationalism than they were to being part of the international proletariat.
Yes.
So the Russians completely fell flat on their faces.
And it's in every case that this has happened. It's just, there's never been international working class solidarity.
The Hungarians ended up fighting back against it. That's what led to the rise of Mussolini, was fighting back against the Russian the Red Communist years from, I think it was 1920 to 22. All of those big evil movements in the early 20th interwar period, that was basically saying, no, we don't want Bolshevism.
Yeah, it's all a response to communism.
Yes.
And so every case a response to communism.
And so this low social trust that we are experiencing in our country because of mass immigration is making class... it's making class consciousness impossible because 50% said that they feel disengaged from society in general. I mean, how do you have class consciousness or solidarity with people who don't speak your language, whose culture you don't recognise, etc.?
And moreover, we get a really good example of this in Swindon, but it's the same everywhere, really, because the thing about the Boris wave is they're not from any one particular place.
Yeah, right? They're from everywhere.
And so they can't even understand each other.
Yes.
And so there's no solidarity between them. They don't care about each other. They do, again, they look at each other with suspicion as they pass in the street.
Which is in the interests of the capitalist class because it keeps the working class divided.
And exactly. So the capitalist has essentially like the whip hand in this. They say, well, I'll offer you a job. And what else are you going to do? You haven't got a social network to to fall back on. It's either that or begging the government for money. So.
Totally. And that's to say nothing of the crime brought by mass immigration, which is also a factor in degrading social trust and making class consciousness impossible. The third argument from a Marxist perspective against mass immigration is that it is neo-colonial exploitation. So
that's totally true.
Yeah. So between between Q4 2020 and Q3 2023, the UK awarded 108,000 entry visas to healthcare professionals from countries that are described by the WHO as having the world's most fragile health systems. Okay, so these are countries that are teetering on the brink where there's really no health infrastructure, and we are poaching their healthcare workers to prop up our own failing public services, and they're failing for a number of reasons, including immigration itself. It's like a kind of self-fulfilling
cure
thing.
Is the poison, as you point out.
Yes, exactly. So it's really, and that's to say nothing of the, again, with my Marxist hat on, the kind of Western imperialism into the Middle East, for example, that has disrupted and destabilized that region, which has led to displacement of people, which has, in turn led them to seek refuge, often illegitimately, in Europe.
So there's an interesting sort of dovetailing here in the advance of medicine. It's not that society is actually that much less dangerous than it used to be. It's just that people survive from violence.
Yes,
a far greater.
This was Steven Pinker's sleight of hand in his the Better Angels of Our Nature book.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's like, we die a lot less than we used to. Yeah, because we can save a lot more people from dying.
Exactly. But if you're in a third world country that just has naturally a much higher rate of violence. And we are stealing all of your highly trained doctors,
or disease,
or whatever it is. But you can see how, like you say, this takes on the aspect of a predatory and extractive system.
And one would think that any self-respecting leftist would look at those countries which are genuinely in a terrible state where people are dying and there's immense human suffering, and they think, actually, maybe I shouldn't be supporting this project of exporting all of their labour to my country to prop up my quality of life.
It's so genuinely extractive as well, just on from purely a materialistic perspective, where it's like, look, those countries paid and raised and trained those people. All of the resources that required to make a doctor in Uganda or whatever we're just pinching for 40, 50,000 pounds a year or something like that. Which that's we're stealing.
And how are they expected to compete when we have such a more powerful economy and are able to offer these people such a better quality of life?
I'm going to have to drag us away from this wet sentimentality that the two of you are engaging in right now, and point out as well a significant number of these will have been done on completely illegitimate grounds.
That's also true.
That is true, but that's the right-wing view.
Yes.
I guess I have to be the right-wing as usual, Carl.
But the point is from the left's own premises, and from their own concerns.
And that's how I'm approaching this.
Which is just totally fair, because if you are a leftist watching this, what are your answers to any of these things?
And that brings us to point number 4, which is that mass immigration
But seriously though, also, what's the left's response supposed to be? That, well, I mean, a lot of these people are coming in here illegitimately on not on fake visas, but illegitimate visas because they've lied about their qualifications, and they will actively admit it online. Just filling in my cousin's university forms, just doing the exams for them, doing all of this one. What's their response to that? They don't have one.
No,
really.
But they don't care about that.
They just
that's the point. They just wouldn't care. Whereas this challenges them on their own grounds, and they then have nothing to say, right? Which brings us to point 4, which is that mass immigration is bourgeois virtue signaling. Now, I don't think I need to necessarily explain that. It's obviously true that the managerial middle class who run our country,
are a party.
The professionals who run society in the West, it makes them feel warm and fuzzy when they go to bat for mass immigration and when they facilitate it, because they think it makes them a moral person, and it's at the expense of the well-being of the working class.
But moreover, it's also at the expense of the well-being of the people that they're bringing in, because there is an implicit class dynamic between this. Who's going to serve our coffee at Pret? Who are our new proletariats that we're importing because we don't like the white proletariat?
Who's going to clean your toilet, Donald Trump?
Exactly.
Great quote
it is explicitly hierarchical. And exploitative and domination. If you're a leftist, you can't deny these aspects to it.
No,
in
totally
fact, and if you do, okay, tell us why. Tell us what your argument is.
And the final point, which I think kind of encapsulates everything I've spoken about so far, to use the language of Louis Althusser, is that mass immigration itself is a repressive state apparatus. Because if you have an indigenous English working class who feel they're being mistreated, or they can strike, or they can organise, or whatever else, right? They can demand better pay, better working conditions, and all the rest of it. But if you allow mass immigration, you can make those people irrelevant by just replacing them, right? So the message they receive is get in line, or you're getting replaced. Get in line, or you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your livelihood, and all the rest of it. And in order to keep those people in line, as we saw with the case of Lucy Connolly earlier today, the ideological state apparatus of the British state exists almost solely at this point to prop up the narrative that mass immigration is good for our society. Whether it's the media or the education system or whatever else, all of these mouthpieces of power, they tell the working class that mass immigration is good for them, despite the fact that their eyes tell them that it isn't, and their pay packets tell them that it isn't, and the price of housing tells them that it isn't. And so, mass immigration is actually a weapon of the state. It's a weapon of capital. It's a weapon of people who are, ultimately self-interested, who want to make themselves feel good and line their own pockets at the expense of basically everyone else in society.
If you are any kind of leftist who claims to care about the working class, again, as far as I'm concerned, this is just an open and shut case.
And if I may, just as a conclusion, the post-woke left who I spoke about last time I was on the show, people like Gary Stevenson and so on, Stevenson has addressed the issue of immigration, but he says he did a whole video in it, and it's quite a good video, as his videos often are, to the chagrin of the audience, no doubt.
I've watched any, so I don't know.
But he says basically that immigration is just a distraction tactic by the capitalist class, and I just think that if you're saying that, you're not a radical. If you're prepared to defend the project of mass immigration, then you're kicking at an open door, right? If you're just going to say it's inequality, well, okay, if it is inequality, what's causing the inequality? Who's causing the inequality? And so I think
he's the insufferable lefty on Twitter posting the picture of the
cookie and
the cookie saying, "Hey, that immigrant wants your cookie." That's not the point. The actual is,
I'm going to give him your cookie.
Yeah, he needs your cookie more than you do. Because when you talk about the working class, a lot of the left these days, unless they are very old school Labour style leftists from 100 years ago, they see it as an international global working class.
Yes.
Well, yeah, some guy in the slums of Manchester might have it hard, but does he have it as hard as a starving child in Africa? That's the way that they look at it. Stelios has explained it quite well in the wealth transfer of, well, we need some kind of equitable wealth transfer and redistribution, but it has to basically be across the entire world.
Just as a quick thing here, So what's interesting about this is how the liberals have managed to kind of one-up the classical Marxists, right? Because it used to be the Marxists had the edge on the liberals quite significantly by saying, well, look, you concede that it's private property that creates inequality. You say you're for equality, therefore private property has to be the thing that goes. And now the liberals have got one up on the Marxists. So even like someone like Gary Stevenson has got to be like, well, I can't possibly criticize mass immigration because of universal liberal human rights. And what I'm essentially forced to do is dodge the issue and just say, oh, it's those guys who are using them as a tool in order to destroy the economy.
And this is the brilliant trick that the capitalist class has played on the left itself. Yeah. They've co-opted them, captured them, and are using them to their own ends. And so I think if the post-woke left want to be a serious force and a seriously radical force, they need to reckon with these critiques, and they need to recognise that so much of their instinctual liberalism when it comes to things like immigration and other social issues, actually it's in the interests of the capitalist class that they're seeking to tear down that they continue to go to bat for these things. So I think they need to break with this stuff completely and come and join us.
So I actually, just a quick end thing here, I don't think they're going to be able to do it.
No, nor do I.
The woke liberalism that we talk about is the consequence of the synthesis of Marxist class dynamics applied to non-economic factors, therefore rendering a kind of synthesis of old Marxism and modern liberalism, which means that essentially they would have to admit that they were reactionaries in order to do it. So I think that they're in a bind there and they can't go anywhere. But again, if you're a leftist, let me know. I'm open to changing my mind.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.